to give you an update. Nationally, the COVID-19 cases in Indian country are 9,000, and for our area, it's about just over 260 cases. Since the last time I talked to you, there's only been one additional case in Idaho and Oregon, but in Washington, there's been an additional 11 cases, and that was since last week. So, and Terry, I'll just send you the slides after the presentation, just the ones we use for the next. We do a tribal call at 10 a.m. As I've mentioned before, and you're all welcome to join that call. One of the things we'll be talking about on today's call at 10 a.m. is the board has an opportunity to have 10 CDC, it's through the CDC Foundation, and they have 10 people that we could potentially get assigned to the Northwest, either to us or to tribes, that could help with contact tracing. They also have scientists, investigators, IT support, communications, lab support, program managers. There's a wide variety of positions these people could hold to help tribes in this time in terms of what they need related to COVID-19. So just wanted to share that is something we're going to be talking with our delegates and those on the call at 11 a.m. this morning, 10 a.m. this morning. And so yeah, I'll put the call-in number if any of you might be interested in being part of that discussion. And I think I'll just go ahead to turn it over to Tom, because I think you may have a lot of questions for Tom.
Hi, good morning. This is Dr. Weiser. I don't have any slides for you today, and I'll just start with like a brief explanation of the different kinds of tests that are out there, and then I'll take a pause and see if people have some specific questions about that. So there's two main types of testing that are available. So there are the diagnostic tests. Those are the things that we've been doing mostly up until this point. We use those tests to try and diagnose if someone has coronavirus. And they are primarily the ones that are done in either the laboratory, like a reference laboratory, or the state public health laboratory, or the rapid tests, which are done at the facility if they have the machine to do it. And that test uses a swab that's placed usually in the nose. It can be done in the back of the mouth as well, but usually we do it in the nose. And it detects pieces of the virus. So it's looking for the DNA or the RNA of the virus, and it's detecting fragments of that virus. And we use that to tell if somebody has an active infection when they present to us with symptoms, or if they're part of a contact tracing. There are some people on that test who test positive but don't have any symptoms. And if it's the beginning of the illness, they might develop symptoms a little bit later, like a day or two after the test is positive. Some people get a positive test and they never develop symptoms, but they can still shed the virus, and so they're still considered infectious. The other kind of test that you're hearing a lot about these days is the antibody test. And this is a blood test. So a sample of blood is either drawn from a vein, or sometimes they can do it by a finger stick, like we're checking sugar for diabetes. And that test looks at antibodies, which is your body's reaction to having had an infection. So when you get infected with something, your body produces antibodies against that virus or that bacteria. And that's what the antibody test is looking for, is those antibodies. So it's not a diagnostic test. Rather, it's a test to tell us that you may have been infected in the past. And there are two kinds of antibodies. One that is more, comes up positive, more recent to when the infection occurred. So within a couple of weeks of being. The other kind takes about 4 to 6 weeks to become positive. And that tells us more in the distant past that you've had this infection. And the difficulty with these antibody tests right now is we don't know how long those antibodies last. The short early onset antibody called IgM, it comes up in about 2 weeks and it goes away in about 6 weeks. That we know. But the IgG antibody, which is the longer lasting one, it starts about 6 weeks after the infection, and we don't know how long it lasts. It may last for a few months, it may last for a year, it may last for a lifetime. It's still too soon to know. Some people, if we're retesting them, may still be positive, and it's now been like 3 months or so. And these are the kinds of antibodies too that we hope to generate when there's a vaccine available. That vaccine will stimulate the immune system to form antibodies that would then provide protection. But that's still an unknown piece. We still don't know if those antibodies will protect you from getting infected again. We think it's likely that that's the case. We hope it's the case, but we don't know for sure. I'll stop there and see if there are any basic questions about those tests, and then I can maybe talk a little bit more detail about some of the tests.
Any questions about the tests, different kinds of tests? Okay, let's just go on.
Leonard here real quick, Dr. Weiser.
Sure.
Are you going to get to where these tests are, which labs they go to?
I don't have a specific recommendation for which lab.
I was thinking more along the lines of more of a technical question. Can it go to any lab, or they go to separate labs?
Yeah.
Not any
So for the
particular lab.
diagnostic test, most folks are using the LabCorp or Quest or Northwest labs. Those are the three main reference labs that people use. The same labs that people have been using in the past for all of their send-out labs, whether it's chemistry tests or CBC tests or anything. Those reference labs are able to run those diagnostic tests. And then for the antibody tests, we have to be really careful. I think there are over 150 different antibody tests being sold. And there are about 13, I haven't checked for a week or so, there are about 13 or 14 individual tests that have actually submitted to the FDA for emergency use authorization, which when they do that, they provide some data about how good that test is, and the FDA reviews that data and then determines that they can get an emergency use authorization for that antibody test. So like I said, there are lots of tests out there. Only a handful have actually gone through this emergency use authorization through the FDA, where you can have any kind of knowledge about how good the test is because they provide that information. So there's an FDA link that you can go to look up if the test you're considering, if you know the brand name of the test, and you can look it up on there to see if it's in the EUA listing. And if it's not, then you might want to try to pick a different test. And then any lab that offers any of those tests would be probably as good as any other lab, simply as long as they're following the recommendations for the test.
I have a question. My question is, for a number of times, testing supplies requests are, I guess, backlogged. And, I know we're doing some testing on our reservation, and we're hoping that we're going to get all the supplies needed to do the testing. So does this mean that testing supplies are more available? Or, because I know it's been a concern for not only for the tribes, but for the states as well, even though President Trump has said, everybody should be tested, then backed away from it. So I'm just wondering if the testing supplies are more available.
I think compared to a month ago or 2 months ago, testing supplies are more available. There are more and more manufacturers in Washington. I know the state of Washington has identified a source that makes the testing viral transport medium in the state of Washington, so it's not being shipped from somewhere else. And that's where they're primarily getting their viral transport medium from. That's the liquid that when you do the test, you do the swab, then you put the swab into plastic vial with this liquid in it, and then you send that off to the lab. So that was one of the limiting factors early on was we ran out of that viral transport medium. And then some of the tests, they found that, well, if you just use saline or salt water, then you could still send the test in that way as long as it got there fast enough. So they've identified some workarounds for that. But yeah, there's all the different aspects of that. You need the swab, you need the plastic vial, you need the liquid to put in there. All of that is needed to actually collect the specimen and get it to the lab. And then at the lab itself, when they receive the specimen, they're going to need different supplies too to be able to run the test in the machine, different reagents and chemicals and things. So hopefully, I don't have any insight as to whether all those things are actually being ramped up the way we're being told they are. But we haven't been told of any significant shortages lately the way we were a couple months ago. And Ron Wan is for IHS, he's the lead for logistics on ordering supplies. So you can contact him if you have specific questions about getting a particular kind of supply. If you're out of swabs or other things, he might be able to help identify a source. And his email is roney.won@ihs.gov. There's a couple of other new things that are happening now in the testing realm. There are home collection tests, which as of a week or so ago, those were still being kind of rationed to people who had a significant exposure or they were a healthcare worker. But you could order those tests online and they would send a kit to your home and then you would do the test yourself, put it back in the kit and send it off and they would give you the result. But they still needed, they still were rationing those to certain high priority populations, including frontline healthcare workers and that sort of thing. We've had a number of calls from tribal programs who have been saying, we want to get everyone tested and they want to send, lots of people into the clinic to get tested or what have you. And it seemed that this might be an avenue where that testing that's being desired by employers or others that doesn't really meet the usual criteria, maybe it could be done by this at-home testing. So as that ramps up, I expect that they'll be able to loosen or liberalize their priorities and, tribes could order those tests through the online ordering and then send it to an employee that they want to get tested for whatever reason they choose. Right now in our clinics, we are still primarily testing those people who have symptoms and those people who have had some kind of exposure. They're either identified through contact tracing or through a healthcare exposure or something like that. That's where we're doing most of our focus. Some of our sites are starting to do, testing of asymptomatic individuals. For example, essential workers, those who work in law enforcement or in corrections. Some of the, one of the tribes I think is testing people who work in the local store or trading post. Others are testing all their EMS workers and others. So there's been a little bit more expansion, opening up of tests to people who don't necessarily have a contact, don't necessarily have symptoms, but perform essential duties. We want to make sure that they're not positive and we're not missing an outbreak that we didn't realize was going on, for example, in a jail setting or something like that.
So
one of the things that we have provided information about is employee testing, where some employers, either tribal employers or even in the community off the reservation, for whatever reason are requiring their employees to have a test before they can come to work. Whether it's as a part of their reopening plan that they want all their employees tested first, or if someone has been off sick for whatever reason, then they're requiring that they have a negative test in order to come back to work. And that creates a bit of a problem, I think, for the medical staff and the clinics, because we have certain criteria that we go by for testing, and it doesn't necessarily fall into that criteria to just test anybody who has been off work sick. So if someone had something that was not at all a respiratory illness, and they had a stomach ache, or they had chest pain or something like that, and they took a couple of days off from work, that's not necessarily consistent with coronavirus, and we wouldn't necessarily recommend testing them clinically. So for an employer to demand that those people get tested for coronavirus before they come back would not really make sense to us clinically, and it can draw resources away from those people who really do need those tests. So what we've asked is that employers accept a letter from the clinician that states that this person was evaluated and is cleared to go back to work, regardless of whether or not we tested them. And that might be an issue that needs to be discussed directly between your tribal health program and your tribal enterprises or tribal employees to really find the right direction forward for your tribe. But for our IHS sites, that's been sort of our recommendation, is that we don't necessarily test everybody to go back to work. And one of the reasons for that is after you've recovered from a coronavirus illness, if it's been at least 10 days and you haven't had a fever or any symptoms in the last 3 days, then testing doesn't add any more information. It can complicate the issue because the test might still show viral fragments and it could last for a couple of weeks. It doesn't mean that you're infectious. It just means pieces of the virus are still left in your body. They can't cause any harm to anybody, but we're still detecting them on the test. And so you could end up having an employee who has to spend 6 weeks or 8 weeks out of work because of those tests being positive still. So that's why we recommend returning to work based on the symptoms and the duration of the illness if it was tested for coronavirus.
So Dr. Weiser, I have a couple of questions. One is, I've heard one tribe say that their testing comes back the same day, or their results, they can get the results the same day, and another tribe that says that it's going to take 3 to 5 days. So that's just depending on their equipment and whether or not they have to send it out?
Right. So some of the tribes do have the rapid test. There's been a lot of news about the rapid test in the last couple of weeks, stating that it's not very accurate. It sometimes can lead to a false negative. So you test somebody with that rapid test and it comes back negative. If that person has symptoms and you really think that they have coronavirus, or they have symptoms and they were exposed to somebody who already tested positive, that negative test is not very helpful. And so you'd want to do another test, a PCR test done by a laboratory, not just a rapid test on that individual. So if you're doing the rapid test in your own facility, the test comes back within 15 minutes for the Abbott. There's another testing platform that takes about 45 minutes to turn around. But most people are doing send-out labs, and those send-outs depend on the capacity of the lab that you're using. And unfortunately, I'm hearing that there are backlogs again at Quest, which is the lab that most of our IHS sites use. I haven't heard if LabCorp or Northwest Labs is having the same kind of backups, but we have one site that is waiting about a week now for results from Quest. So if you need the result right away and you have a rapid test, I would recommend going ahead and doing that. If it's negative, but you have a strong suspicion that it should have been positive, then I would recommend doing a PCR test and sending it to the lab. If the rapid test is positive, then you've got your answer, and you should isolate that person and begin contact tracing to find out who else might be positive that person's had contact with. Does that answer your question about that?
Yes, yes. I kind of answered both questions. So is there any other questions for Dr. Weiser? Questions? Okay, thank you so much for being with us. And as Laura mentioned, the health board call will be at 10 a.m. this morning, and she has put in the chat box the link for the Zoom link in the chat box. So thank you both for being with us again.
Hey, Terry.
Thank you.
Terry?
Yes.
I have a question probably for Laura.
Sure.
So Laura, you mentioned the data or the information on the total number of cases in Indian country. What's not really clear to me is are you collecting information on how many people have recovered, how many cases are active, you know, or any of that information? I mean, when we're looking at total 9,000 Native Americans infected, I mean, I'm thinking, whoa, is that all active right now? Or I don't understand the further details. Can you address that a little bit? I think you're on mute.
That, yeah. So I'm trying to think right now, and Dr. Weiser might know this off the top of his head because we're working with IHS on collecting the data. And right now, the number I gave you is the total of positive cases. And so it doesn't have the number of recovered cases. So I'm going to just take a quick look, and Dr. Weiser, maybe you know offhand if that data is also being collected by IHS in terms of how many people have recovered.
Yeah, I know we're starting to hear that in our morning reports from the federal service units. They tell us whether or not they have any cases that are still on isolation. And if they don't, then they tell us that all their cases have recovered. And the general guideline is that if a person tests positive and is not hospitalized and has not died after 28 days from the date of that test, then we consider them as recovered. And so there's an indirect way of trying to calculate that information based on that kind of general rule of thumb. There may be cases where someone has a prolonged illness and they are hospitalized for 6 weeks or so, but most cases do recover within about 4 weeks or so, and from their date of testing positive. And so you could use that as a general rule of thumb. I know the IHS is interested in trying to add that as a column to their website. I don't think that they've actually been able to do that yet because we don't, it would just take a whole nother manipulation of the data collection system that every time they make a change, it throws everything into a cattywampus. So they're probably not collecting that right now.
I have a question for Laura. I mean, I was not on the conference call last week, and you say one additional case for Oregon and Washington, or Oregon and Idaho, and 11 for Washington, but I have no clue what those numbers are.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry about that. I cut it a little bit short just because I wanted Dr. Weiser to have plenty of time. So in Idaho, there's 20 cases, and so there's been one more. There was 19 last week, and then in Oregon it's 32. So last week it was 31, and then in Washington it's a total of 201. And I will make sure to send Terry the slides that we use for our 10 a.m. presentation so that you all have that and she can circulate it to you, and it has the numbers that I just shared with you.
All right, thank you.
Do you have regions for the new cases, 11 cases in Washington?
I will have to check with Victoria. I know with our data sharing agreements with the tribes, we are limited in how much we can share, but let me check on that and get back to you on that.
Well, thank you.
David Whitener. David, did Laura answer your question? He had a question in the chat box. Is there data collection on total number of tests done in Indian country? But I think she answered your question on that, correct?
Yeah, there is actually at the IHS COVID-19 website, you'll see the total number of cases. So it'll have the total number of positive and total number of negative cases. And so there's been, actually, I was just gonna, I'll put the link to that site in the chat box. So it looks like for a total number of cases of testing across Indian country, it's been 102,731. So I can put that in the chat box so that you can all have that link. It's also, if you haven't been to our website, or we have a COVID-19, several web pages now dedicated to COVID-19, and we're constantly updating it. We put our legend policy update on there. We have a funding chart. We check all of the funding that has been coming down from Congress has appropriated for COVID-19, and we basically track every single source of funding and how you access that, or if it's in tribal consultation, and that's something we update every week.
Okay, any other questions for Laura or Dr. Weiser? Okay.
Thank you.
And now Cleora is unable to be with us today. She had wanted to speak about collecting data on the racial incidents that have taken place during this COVID period. However, something came up and she wasn't able to join us. So today we have with us Dante Desiderio from NAFOA, and also Jackson Brossi from Native CDFI. Dante, do you want to begin? Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having us. And this is our first day where we're not having our morning briefs. So every morning since the crisis began, we hosted a morning brief on all the news and everything happening here in DC. So those turned out pretty well. So this is the first time we're not. So that just shows things are actually slowing down on the policy front. At least we're getting some sort of hiatus before things kick up again on the new round of legislation. So we'll see what all of that looks like. But I wanted to talk a little bit, and we have Jackson Brossi on here from the Native CDFI Network, who can talk a little more detail on the CARES Act funding for the CDFIs, and then maybe some of the other asks coming up. But I want to talk about something that we may have missed because of all the other excitement going on. So there's been a project we've been working on for the past couple of years in getting the Community Reinvestment Act, getting Indian country included in that. And that does impact the CDFIs and the relationship with the banks and some of the investments that are going to be made. So I just want to touch on that. That news came out last week where the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the OCC, that regulates all the large federally chartered banks, had changed their regulations when it comes to the Community Reinvestment Act. So initially this was to prevent redlining back in the 1970s. And the idea was to have banks invest in disadvantaged communities, and wherever you're putting a branch, that bank needed to serve that community. So a lot has changed since 1970s. There's been a lot of updates in the banking industry. Now we have banks that are completely online. So how does that all impact it if they have no branch networks? So we were reaching out really early on the CRA with the new controller to work through Indian country issues. We put together a proposal pretty quickly. The controller on his visits to Atlanta, DC, and New York City fit in a visit to Indian country, and I think it really changed his entire view of how they should include Indian country in the CRA changes. So this is billions and billions of dollars on the flow of capital. It will impact it. So Indian country in this past week has gotten everything we asked for, or close to it, what can be reasonably expected in the CRA. So this is really the first time that Indian country has been included in a really good way in a Community Reinvestment Act. So I'm hoping, or we're hopeful, that it will change the way that banks do business in Indian country. So I wanted to just talk about a couple of those highlights. One is they're moving more towards a deposit-based system rather than a branch system. For those virtual banks that are online, there's a large bank in Salt Lake City that does business all over the country. It's wherever they have deposits now. But the important thing for Indian country is that we are in every bank's assessment area, whether they have a branch there, whether they have a deposit there or not. So if you're a Citibank and you're doing business in New York City, and that's your set area for the most of your transactions, you have to start doing business with Indian country. So that applies to every federally chartered bank that we are now in everybody's assessment area. So that used to be confusing before, and it also includes some of the larger projects. So those big infrastructure projects, banks can get credit for it. They know where they stand automatically now. There's a better system for tracking that. So there's a lot more clarity of the inclusion of Indian country. The other thing that it's done, which is really good for us, is that it's listed Indian country as the distressed area, which means that if you're investing in Indian country, whether it's wastewater or any other infrastructure or other Indian country projects, you get 2 times the credit. So the only other areas that are considered in that are the really distressed areas like the Mississippi Delta or the Appalachia area, and then Indian country. So we get 2 times the credit for banks investing in Indian country. It also, just because you're not a federally chartered bank doesn't mean you're going to be left out of this. Not all banks are going to understand how to meet this obligation. So they're going to be turning to CDFIs, they're going to be turning to other community-owned banks and smaller banks. So the key banks may turn and partner with Umpqua Bank because they want to be able to meet these credits. It may not be a great example since Key Bank is all over Indian country, but other banks that don't normally do business in Indian country will turn to those partnerships a bit more. And I think one of the exciting things for CDFIs, which if I were running a CDFI or involved in that, I would start these relationships now. Banks are going to be allowed to do equity investments, and those stay on the books for the entire time the bank holds that equity position. So they continue to get credit for that. So you can see by all of these changes, we get 2 times the credit. All these different types of investments count. There's equity investments involved, and we're in all banks' assessment areas. That this is broad, sweeping change for Indian country. So I think of all the different constituencies in the CRA, Indian country, I think it's safe to say, did the best in these regulatory changes. So if you are doing business with a bank or have those relationships, the larger federally chartered banks, those are the ones we're going to start to educate those banks on how to meet those credits. We're going to be starting, and it might be good for the tribes to start reaching out if you do have relationships there, to let them know that your investments count twice as much as others for the CRA, things like that, especially in some of the more remote areas or in areas where it's more difficult to get credit. So I just pause there, and I know we want to talk a little bit about the CDFIs in the CARES Act, and we did get some relief, but I think there's it's not as good as it sounds, right, Jackson?
Well, yeah, you're right. You're right there, Dante. Thanks for teeing that up. And thanks to everybody from ATNI for inviting us. I have a couple of slides that I already had, but I don't think I can share them, but I can email them out later. Taking a step back, I think the Northwest area has a really strong CDFI presence, and that really starts right here at ATNI. Amber's been a great partner for us and really leader in the area, in the Northwest Native group, CDFIs have created their own Northwest Native Lending group. So it's headed up by ATNI, Chehalis, Lummi, and I see my friend Henry Kagi's on. NACDC out in Montana are doing great things. Nez Perce, Nimipu, Northwest Native Development with our friend Ted Piccolo's out here. Tala Fund is represented by Natalie Charlie, who serves on my board and who's great help. And then Dave Tovey, I'll get to Dave Tovey, but Dave Tovey's been great with us, and Shoshone Bannock and Yakima. So I think this is very pertinent. I was going to take a step back and talk a bit about COVID's impact on CDFIs in general. So back in March, we did a really early study right when things started to impact folks. And as early as March 23rd, we found that 89% of native CDFIs had already been impacted. And the majority of those had already been contacted by their clients about restructuring loans. And so obviously when they restructure their loans, that will impact their operations, because a lot of CDFIs make them some of their operations money off of the interest of these loans. And so if they restructure them, that impacts them directly. So early on, we knew that our native CDFIs were going to be hit hard, and they've been very active in doing what we can. With regards to the CARES Act, however, we were pushing for $100 million for the Treasury's CDFI Assistance Fund, or Native American CDFI Assistance Fund, NACA. And unfortunately, the CDFI fund didn't get any money at all. That's been a challenge for us. However, we have, I guess the CDFI fund has great champions in the House, and the recent House bill, the HEROS bill, included $1 billion for the CDFI fund, of which $25 million would be targeted for native CDFIs. That said, I think that bill's dead in the Senate, and so we have our work cut out for us. As far as kind of the big numbers that were highlighted in the CARES Act initially, the funds were really designed for, unfortunately didn't meet the needs of native CDFIs as far as being able to get money out and being a lender for PPPs. And so initially there was a hurdle of $50 million for native CDFIs to participate as lenders in the PPP. That hurdle got moved down to $10 million in loans in the past 12 months. But that is still a hurdle really too high for most of our native CDFIs. I also wanted to flag that we've had difficulty accessing the PPP, and the NAFOA and National Congress of American Indians have supported us because while most non-tribal CDFIs have been able to get a PPP loan, the SBA's previous regulations actually made it impossible for groups like CDFIs to get the 7A loan, which was the loan that the PPP was stood up on top of. And so there's still a lot of uncertainty whether the Treasury might want to claw back, or the SBA might want to claw back some of the money that our native CDFIs have received. So NAFOA, NCI, and ourselves, we wrote a letter to the SBA outlining this problem, and we haven't heard back, and it's coming up on 2 weeks now. So that's a bit concerning. I think maybe I'll before I stop, also wanted to say that we have two resources we want to make available for folks. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I should be able to share my screen now. Perfect. Two resources we want to make available for our folks. One is we have a weekly member call that everyone's invited to. And so this is, we had the pleasure of being joined by Dave Tovey last week, as well as Kevin Alice. And this coming week, we're going to have Sharice Davids, Congresswoman Sharice Davids, member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And then we try to feature our members now, and we have a lady named Tawny Brunch, who's head of Lakota Funds out in South Dakota, and she also serves on advisory boards, one for the Federal Reserve Bank. So we're pretty excited about that. That'll be Friday. And so you're invited. You can go to our website and look at that. The flag for you is a more technical financial kind of software overview that we're doing with the University of Minnesota. And that'll be tomorrow. And we'll be talking about different financial information and transition planning for farmers. So if you have anybody that's in fishing, actually, these are really good resources, really high quality technical resources. And we have our previous sessions on our. One thing I wanted to add before it goes is, underline what Dante said. The CRA really is a great opportunity. It's $400 to $500 billion that moved through the program. And we did a survey this month, and we found that 76% of our folks had not received loans from a bank that were CRA eligible. So we think there's a lot of room to grow. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dante. And thank you, Jackson. Do we have any questions for these gentlemen?
Terry, so Henry,
Go ahead.
what are we planning for phase 4 on this whole next round of congressional legislation that we're looking at? We got any language that we're introducing, or is that Sharice Davis that's going to talk about that? Jason or Dante?
Well, for us, for the Native CDFI network, the biggest bang for our buck would be getting $100 million in the Native American CDFI Assistance Fund, and that would be money that could go directly to places like the Lummi CDFI, and that could help them both with technical assistance and also provide them capital for lending. But in order to get there, we need some strong support from Republican senators.
So, Councilman Kagi, this is Dante. So we're trying to do a couple of things on phase 4. I know there's broader asks that have been put forward for a lot of other projects, but we wanted to make sure that we focused on a couple of areas. One is on the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is for tribal governments. We wanted to expand the use of the fund or the funds that are available. We wanted to push the date back further for tribes being able to use that beyond the December 30th date. And we also wanted to open that up for one, it's good to have mitigation and prevention, and also taking care of all the health issues and economic issues, but we also wanted to have Indian country come out of this crisis in a way that they can be better prepared going forward. So there's an emergency infrastructure, emergency facilities component for an eligibility for use of funds that we're putting forward. The other things are, in order to have that build out, of course, some of the capital issues that we've talked about for a while, I think they become much more relevant, accessing the tax credits for housing and other community facilities, and also better use of tax exempt debt. We also wanted to clarify from that huge $500 billion economic stabilization fund, tribes are put in a place in that fund. The Federal Reserve Bank has moved tribes into eligible for business relief and not necessarily for government relief, which is what the law says. So we wanted to give more explicit instructions to be able to help tribes to park the debt or else get loan guarantees coming out of that. So those are some of the more specific things that we wanted to put forward in this next round of funding.
So I think supporting this, Leonard, I really want to see us do something with the CDFIs, and meaning that, you know, we have about 600 fishermen here at Lummi, and a lot of our guys we're kind of seeing this as the long-term impact, you know, and we got 14 tribes in the Puget Sound that are dependent on the fishery, and we have close to 200 small businesses on the res as well. So the CDFI really is critical for some of these small businesses to survive. And I'd like to see us get a letter to support this $100 million that Jason talked about, to add that to the list.
Yeah,
This is
we
Jeff.
can work on that. That's in the COVID 4 or 5. Which one is it? The one that's out. The houses. Was it in the House language?
It was. Well,
Okay.
well, part of it was. It's 25 million. 100, but
Okay, if you could get the kind of a general sample letter for ATNI to consider, that'd be awesome. And just get it to Terry, and we can get that on our next executive board meeting, or do it by phone vote. So that'd be great.
absolutely. Thanks. Will
Mhm.
do.
All right. Anything else? We got to get it moving here, guys.
Can I put you out there, Dante? If anybody has any questions about some of the how you can spend your COVID money, Dante may be able to answer that.
That is putting me on the spot. I can tell you from the conversations we've had with Treasury, and also the conversations we've had with other tribes and what they're putting together. I think there's strength in numbers on use of funds. I'd be happy to give our thoughts on the use of funds. Yeah, and I think there's starting to be some good examples of what tribes are doing that meets the intent of the law, and also the FAQs and guidance that Treasury put out.
Hey, Dante and Henry, are the states having the same problem we're having on spending this money?
It's kind of interesting that there are states that have made news on the creative use of funds that may get caught up in this. So they are having similar issues with tribes. I believe, you know, the states are just based on population. The tribes have a specific reference in the law based on expenditures. But I think to get to the heart of that question, I think tribes are being held to a different standard, and hopefully that'll lighten up over time.
Because in the beginning, we were asking to be treated the same as the states, and we kind of lost that.
We did, yeah. And that's apparent in the different requests for information. With tribes, there seems to be this idea that you're doing compliance up front, and with states, it's here's the money and spend it accordingly. So I think that's the biggest affront, is that we have to put in and prove the employment information, prove the expenditures, instead of having the compliance and the audits take care of it. So I think from there, it goes into them trying to include us with states in the FAQs, but they seem to still be separating some of the uses of funds in there as well, which shouldn't be the case. So we're talking with them all the time on their ability to loosen that up. And I think some tribes are, obviously tribes are in different places, and they're going to need to spend the money according to their own situations. But some tribes are doing a good job at preventing, and you have less expense on healthcare. So they should be able to spend it on other things, like building out different facilities to better prepare for any sort of pandemics going forward, or second rounds.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Is there any more questions for Dante or Jackson?
Yeah,
Just
real quick, this is Taylor.
Oh, go ahead, Taylor.
So I'm just curious, has there been any discussions in regards to providing payouts to tribal members under the General Welfare Exclusion Act?
Usually when someone says payouts, it means a per capita distribution, and that's not the case with this. It would have to be in the form of looking at each situation as it relates to the impacts of the healthcare crisis, which includes an economic component. So any straight distribution for per capita distribution will likely be questioned. This is going to be, but if you're setting something up in your general welfare program where you're taking care of different needs for the community or different needs for individuals based on the impact, you should be okay. And I think the key to a lot of this is what governing documents are you setting up front to be able to justify this, comply with it, and in the end be prepared if somebody asks those questions in an audit. But yeah, just the idea of a straight per capita payment will likely not be allowable. But anything that's impacted and having a program that's set up to deal with the impacts, I think is a better way to go.
Yes, one more, Terry. It's Leonard. Hey, Dante, I just want to thank you and your staff and your organization for their leadership during this. You guys have been instrumental and essential throughout. So I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thanks, Chairman. Appreciate it.
We appreciate you both being with us today. Thank you. And the only thing that we have to do on the West Coast, Dante, is wake up between 6 and 7 to see if that notification has been there or not. So
Yeah,
anyway,
thanks
thank
for
you.
tuning in.
That's probably one of the most informational calls that we have. So thank you for that. So thank you for being with us today.
Sure thing. Good to hear.
And with that, Leonard, I think that's it.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and hope you had a good Memorial Day weekend. And you know, we're just you know, everybody's you know, going in uncharted waters here, and so we got to keep getting as much information and technical information as we can, and we'll keep these calls going and be ready to not only get information but share information with us that you think is helpful. And we you know, one of the things, of course, as tribal leaders, a lot of us want to, you know, people have questions, we can answer them, and it's frustrating when you don't have an answer to every question that you want and they expect that. So I know a lot of you have been going through that, and so just hang in there. I think that we all want to do what's best for our respective tribes, and I think that we'll definitely be engaged when the Senate decides to get some legislation going again to try to fix some of the things that are outstanding. So I'd just like to thank Terry and James and Elaine and Amber and everybody else for working so hard for ATNI, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.